The first night of my marriage was supposed to be filled with warmth, soft laughter, and the quiet comfort of knowing that I wasn't alone anymore. But instead, I sat on the edge of a beautifully decorated bed, staring at the closed door my husband had walked out of only moments before. I tried to tell myself it was fine, that maybe he just needed a moment. Viewers, I need a small favor from you. If this story touches your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, pressing the bell icon, and letting me know in the comments which city you are listening from. It truly encourages me and helps me create more stories like this. I took a slow breath, letting the soft glow of the bedside lamp calm my nerves. The room smelled faintly of roses from the bouquet my aunt had placed on the windowsill earlier that day. Everything around me was beautiful, except for the hollow feeling inside my chest. I felt like a guest in someone else's celebration. My husband, Daniel, had barely spoken during the wedding dinner. He smiled for photos, nodded courteously when relatives congratulated us, but his eyes, they held a distance I couldn't name. And now, on the night we were supposed to begin our life together, he had simply whispered, "I'll be right back," before stepping out of the room. I listened for footsteps, for the soft click of the bathroom door, anything, but all I heard was silence, and that silence felt heavier than my wedding dress had earlier that evening. I folded my hands in my lap and let my eyes wander around the room. A framed picture of his parents stood on the dresser. A small candle flickered near the curtains. A neat set of his books lined the shelf above the nightstand. Classic stories, all worn at the edges, as if he had read them many times. Everything about Daniel was orderly, controlled, quiet, and I had told myself that I liked that it meant he was mature, stable, thoughtful. But now I wasn't so sure. Tonight, that quiet felt like a long hallway I didn't know how to walk through. As minutes passed, my heartbeat grew heavier. I reached for the thin blanket at the bottom of the bed, pulling it over my shoulders. It was strange how a person could be surrounded by so much comfort and still feel cold inside. I closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them, he would be standing at the door. He wasn't. Instead, the whole house remained still, like it was holding its breath. I decided to distract myself by revisiting the events of the day. Maybe if I replayed everything, I could understand what was going on. Our wedding had been small. Daniel insisted on that. Only close family, a few friends, and a simple ceremony in a garden filled with white flowers. The sky had been bright, the air warm. When we exchanged vows, his hands held mine softly, but there was a tremor in them, something I had brushed off as nerves. Now, I wasn't so sure it was nerves at all. I remembered how his cousin Laura had hugged me after the ceremony. She whispered, "Take care of him. He's a good man. He just carries a lot inside." At the time, I smiled politely, thinking it was just a sweet gesture. But sitting alone on our wedding bed, her words pressed gently on the back of my mind, like a hint I had missed. I leaned back against the pillows and looked at the ceiling. A simple light fixture hung there, casting a warm glow. It made the room look gentle, almost serene. I felt a small sigh leave my lips. I had dreamed of a soft beginning to my marriage, a peaceful, loving start. Blankets was often different from dreams. After what felt like nearly an hour, I stood up and wrapped the blanket around myself like a shawl. Maybe Daniel needed time. Maybe he was overwhelmed. Maybe he thought he wasn't ready. 1,000 explanations moved through my mind like gentle waves, but none of them settled inside me. So I decided to wait a little longer. I walked toward the window and pulled the curtain slightly to the side. The street outside was quiet, illuminated by a single street lamp. A few parked cars lined the road. The night was calm, still. It looked like a world where nothing unusual ever happened. But something unusual was happening, and I was right in the middle of it. As I stood there, I thought about my own family. My mother had always told me, marriage is a journey, and every journey starts with a single, honest step. But what do you do when your partner doesn't take that first step with you? What do you do when the journey begins with silence? I didn't have an answer then. I placed my hand on the cool window glass and watched a small leaf blow across the street. For a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake, if marrying a man whose emotions were hidden behind calm eyes was the right choice. But I shook the thought away. I had promised myself that I wouldn't judge him too quickly. Everyone carried something after all. Maybe tonight, I would learn what he carried. After a while, I returned to the bed and sat quietly again. My mind kept circling around the same question. Where was he? The sound of the clock ticking on the wall felt louder now. Each second stretched longer, as if the night itself didn't want to move forward. I lay back against the pillows, pulling the blanket close. My eyes grew heavy from waiting, but my heart stayed alert, listening for the moment the front door opened or footsteps approached the room. But the house remained quiet. Near midnight, when the world outside seemed to fall into deeper silence, that I finally heard something. A soft sound. Quadrid. It was faint at first, like a distant sigh. I held my breath, listening carefully. Then it came again. A trembling, uneven sound, and slowly, I realized what it was. Someone was crying. A manse. A quiet, restrained, aching kind of crying across the hallway. My heart tightened, because I knew that voice. It was my husband. I froze for a moment, unsure if my ears were imagining it. The sound was so gentle, so controlled, like someone was trying their hardest not to be heard. I sat upright on the bed, the blanket slipping off my shoulders, and listened again. The quiet house made every breath I took feel loud, but beneath it, the soft, trembling sound continued. It was him, Daniel, my husband, crying on our wedding night. For a few seconds, I didn't move. My mind felt caught between fear and ache, fear of what I might discover, and ache because the person I had just promised a lifetime to was breaking in the next room, alone. I placed my feet carefully on the floor, the carpet soft under my toes. My heart thudded as I walked slowly toward the door. The hallway light was dim, a soft yellow that barely touched the edges of the walls. I stepped out, holding my breath as if the silence itself might shatter. The crying grew clearer, though still quiet, like he was burying his face into something to muffle it. My steps were slow, hesitant, not because I didn't want to help him, but because I didn't know how. We were still strangers in so many ways. Married, but strangers. I stopped outside the guest room, the door slightly open. A thin line of light spilled onto the hallway floor. I reached out, gently pushing the door wider. It creaked softly. And there he was. Daniel sat on the edge of the guest bed, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. The sight of him broke something inside me. His shoulders were shaking, barely, but enough to tell me this wasn't the kind of crying someone could stop easily, not the kind you wipe away and pretend never happened. This was grief. Old, buried, heavy grief. For a moment, I stood quietly at the doorway, unsure if I should enter. I didn't want to frighten him or make him close himself off even more. I softly whispered, "Daniel?" His head lifted abruptly. He wiped at his face quickly, almost roughly, as if he had been caught doing something shameful. His eyes were red, and he tried to avoid looking at me. I'm fine," he said, his voice tight and uneven. "I just needed a minute." We both knew that wasn't true. I stepped inside slowly. "It's midnight," I said gently. "You didn't come back." Crimson hard. "I didn't want to worry you." "But you did," I replied softly. He looked away, his jaw tightening like he was trying to hold himself together. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally he whispered, "I'm sorry." The room felt small, filled with a quiet sadness that didn't belong on a wedding night. I walked closer and sat on the other side of the bed, leaving a respectful distance between us. I didn't touch him. I didn't want to force comfort. I simply sat there, letting him feel that he wasn't alone. He took a shaky breath. "I shouldn't have left you. I know that. I couldn't stay in that room." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, turning his wedding ring slowly around his finger. It was a nervous habit I had never seen before. The silence stretched, and I could see him struggling with something inside. Finally, he whispered, "I wasn't ready." The words were simple, but the pain behind them wasn't. I waited, giving him space to explain, and slowly he did. "Kang, he told me about someone I had never heard of before. Her name was Emily," he said quietly. "We were supposed to get married 4 years ago." My heart softened. I didn't speak, just listened. "She died in an accident," he continued, his voice breaking slightly, "right before the wedding. One moment she was laughing with me in the car. The next moment..." He stopped, swallowing hard. "The next moment I was holding her hand while waiting for the ambulance." He closed his eyes, and a tear slipped down his cheek. "I never really healed from it," he confessed. "Everyone told me time would make it easier, but time just made it quieter. The pain never left, it only hid." I let the quiet fill the room, letting him breathe through the weight of his memories. "When I saw you walking down the aisle today," he whispered, "I felt 2 emotions at once: hope and guilt." His voice cracked. Guilt for moving forward. Guilt for smiling. Guilt for standing where I once stood with her. My chest tightened, not from jealousy, not from insecurity, but from an ache so human, so deeply tender, that my eyes grew warm. I reached for his hand, not to pull him closer, but to let him know I was present. He didn't move away. "I thought I could do this," he said. "I thought I was ready. But when we entered the room tonight, I panicked. I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was betraying her memory." I understood now. I understood why he left, why he cried, why he trembled. He wasn't avoiding me. He was struggling with his past. And instead of anger, I felt compassion. I took a slow breath. "Daniel, grief doesn't disappear just because we want it to. It takes time, real time, and you don't have to hide it from me." He finally looked at me, really looked at me, with eyes filled with relief and exhaustion. "You're not replacing her," I said gently, "and I'm not asking you to. But I'm here, and maybe we can walk through this together." Again, but this time he wasn't hiding. He was letting himself break in front of me, letting himself be seen. For a moment, the only sound in the room was his quiet crying. It wasn't the silent, hidden kind anymore. It was the release of a wound held too long. I sat beside him, steady and patient. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 20. Neither of us counted. When his breathing finally steadied, he whispered, "I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't," I said, "but hiding your pain would have hurt us both." Fluorescent slowly. And for the first time that night, I felt the smallest step toward trust. Not the trust that comes from perfect beginnings, blockchain that forms in honest, imperfect moments where 2 people sit quietly in the dark and choose not to walk away. Eventually, he wiped his eyes and looked toward the door of our room. "I don't think I can sleep in there tonight," he whispered. "That's okay," I replied softly. "We don't have to. Not tonight." He let out a breath that sounded like relief, and in that quiet midnight moment, I realized something. Our marriage hadn't started the way I imagined. It started with grief, with truth, with cracks. But sometimes, cracks are where the light enters. The next morning arrived gently, with pale sunlight slipping through the thin curtains of the guest room. I had drifted off sometime near dawn, sitting upright against the headboard while Daniel lay curled on the other side of the bed, exhausted from crying. We hadn't spoken much after that midnight confession. Words felt too heavy, too small for what he had shared. When I opened my eyes, he was already awake. He sat in the chair across from me, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, staring at the floor like the quiet weight of daylight had brought new thoughts he didn't know how to hold. "Good morning," I said softly. He lifted his head slightly. "Morning." I sensed hesitation in his voice, like he didn't know if he had ruined everything or started fixing it, and honestly, I didn't know either. I stood slowly, stretching my stiff shoulders. "Do you want some tea? Or coffee?" He rubbed his forehead. "Tea, if it's not too much trouble." "It's not," I said. "Nothing about caring for someone is trouble." Those words touched him, I could tell. He didn't smile. Daniel didn't smile easily, but his eyes softened. I went to the kitchen and began boiling water. The house was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Boxes from our wedding gifts were stacked against the wall, untouched. The flowers from the ceremony sat in a vase on the table, still fresh. Everything around us looked new, but between us, the air still carried old stories. When I returned with 2 mugs, he thanked me quietly and wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "I'm sorry for everything," he said. "For last night, for breaking down, for starting our marriage like this." "Daniel," I said gently, sitting beside him, "starting our marriage with honesty is better than starting it with silence." Subtracti took a deep breath, looking relieved yet conflicted. "I want to move forward," he whispered. "I really do. But I don't want to pretend I'm okay. I don't want to hide from you." "Then don't hide," I replied. He nodded slowly, but something in his gaze told me there was more he hadn't told me. I waited. Flooring, he spoke. "There's something else," he said. My heart tightened slightly, not with fear, but with readiness. Last night had shown me that the only way forward was through the truth, no matter how heavy. "What is it?" I asked softly. He hesitated for a long moment. "I never told you what happened after Emily passed. Not everything." Miskin letting him speak when he was ready. He took a painful breath. "After the accident, I stopped living. I didn't leave the house. I didn't see anyone. My family tried to help, but I pushed them away. For almost a year, I didn't talk to anyone. I barely ate. I felt like my life ended with hers. I felt a deep ache for him. That must have been unbearable." "It was," he said, "but the worst part wasn't the grief. It was the promise." Nasday, I leaned forward slightly. "What promise?" He looked at his hands. "I made her a promise on the night she died. I promised I wouldn't replace her." My breath caught quietly in my chest. "The last thing she said to me," he continued, voice trembling, "was that she wanted me to live a full life. But I never heard it that way. I only heard the part where I told her I loved her more than anything in the world. And after she died, that sentence became a prison." I swallowed softly. "You feel like loving someone again would break that promise?" He nodded, eyes wet again, but not crying. "Last night, when I saw you in our room, I panicked. My heart wanted to move closer, but my mind screamed that I was betraying her memory." His honesty was raw, painful, but real. I spoke softly. "Daniel, love isn't a limited space. Giving someone a place in your heart doesn't erase someone else's." He closed his eyes tightly, as if absorbing the words slowly. We sat in silence for a moment. Then, gently, I asked, "Why did you marry me, Daniel? Truly?" He looked up at me then, and in his eyes I saw something new, something honest and fragile. "Because you made me feel alive again," he said quietly, "and that scared me more than losing everything." A warm shiver ran through me. His words weren't poetic, they were raw, unpolished truth. "Crimson, when I met you, for the first time in years, I felt something other than grief. Something small. Something warm. I didn't know what to do with it, but I wanted to follow it. I let that sink in. For him, choosing me wasn't replacing someone, it was choosing life again. But the turning point wasn't just his confession, it was what happened next, something I hadn't expected. He stood suddenly and walked to the closet, a carved lid. The box looked old, well-kept, and heavy with emotion. He placed it in my hands. This was Emily's. I looked up at him, surprised. "You don't need to show me this." "I do," he said, voice steady. "Because if we're going to build something real, I don't want any walls between us." Slowly, I opened the lid. Inside were small pieces of her life, photos, a bracelet, a dried rose petal, a handwritten note, a movie ticket, a ring box that still held her engagement ring. Everything inside was drenched in memories, but the item that caught my eye was a small folded letter. Daniel looked away, as if embarrassed. "She wrote that for our future wedding day." I felt a soft ache in my heart as I lifted the letter carefully. "Do you want me to read it?" I asked. He nodded slowly. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. Her handwriting was neat, gentle. The letter wasn't long, and it wasn't sad. Kung, it was full of hope. She wrote about how excited she was, how grateful she felt, how deeply she loved him. And near the end, one line stood out. "If life ever separates us, promise me you will not stop living. Promise me you will love again, because your heart was made to hold more than one story." When I finished reading, I looked up. Daniel wasn't crying. He was breathing, deeply, slowly, as if something inside him had finally loosened. "I never read that line," he whispered. "I always stopped before the end." I folded the letter gently and placed it back in the box. "Maybe," I said softly, "tonight was the first step in keeping her real wish." He lowered his head, overwhelmed, and in that moment, I knew something had shifted. Not everything was healed, not everything was fixed, but something had opened. A door. Filmmakers, slashing one, leading toward healing. And for the first time since the wedding began, I felt that maybe we were not walking into a broken beginning, but into a fragile, hopeful one. I sat on the edge of our bed that morning, long after Daniel had left the room. The sunlight through the curtains felt warmer than usual, almost like it was trying to comfort me. I placed my palm over my heart, feeling its slow, steady rhythm. For the first time in years, that rhythm didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel tired. It felt free. But freedom comes with a strange quiet, a quiet that makes you wonder what comes next. I walked to the kitchen and brewed myself a cup of tea. I watched the steam rise, curling softly in the air, and I whispered to myself, "It's finally over, isn't it?" My voice sounded small but steady. When Daniel returned later that day, his steps were slow, almost hesitant. He stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure he belonged in the house anymore. And maybe, for the first time, he didn't. He looked at me, not with anger, but with something I had rarely seen in him, uncertainty. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded. We sat at the dining table, our quiet battlefield of so many unspoken things over the years. Daniel clasped and unclasped his hands. "I know I hurt you," he said softly. "I know I made our home feel like a place where you had to tiptoe. I didn't want that. I swear I didn't." His voice cracked a little. I stayed silent, not out of coldness, but because I finally understood something important. Condemned to fix him, I didn't need to heal him. I didn't need to carry both our weights anymore. "Daniel," I said gently, "I don't hate you. I don't even blame you the way I used to. I know you struggled. I know you had pain you never learned how to speak out loud. But I can't live inside that pain with you. I can't breathe there."
He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again. His eyes were glossy, the way they had been on that first night, the way they had been for so many years when he thought no one was watching. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered, "by keeping my darkness away from you." "And all you did," I said softly, "was build a wall that kept us apart." He lowered his head. "I'm sorry. For everything." Rectangular. For the first time, I truly believed him. But belief is not enough to rebuild a life. Unrestricted. I think we need time apart. Real time. Not a pause. Not a temporary break. Time to grow into different people. Daniel's shoulders dropped. For a moment, I thought he might argue, beg, or promise change. But he didn't. He simply nodded. "I understand," he said quietly.
Maybe that's what we should have done a long time ago. There was no anger in his voice, no blame, just a kind of tired acceptance. And that was the first moment I realized we were finally on the same page. Daniel moved to a small apartment across town. He sent me a short message on the first night. "I hope you sleep peacefully." I replied, "I hope you do too." We didn't talk every day, but we weren't strangers either. We checked in occasionally, simple questions, simple answers. He began therapy, real therapy. He joined a support group for men dealing with emotional trauma from childhood. He told me, "It's the first time I said things out loud without drowning." And I felt genuinely proud of him, not as a wife, not as a partner, but as a human who wanted to see another human get better. Meanwhile, I rebuilt pieces of myself I didn't know were broken. I started morning walks. I took long, slow breaths without feeling watched. I sang again while cooking, softly at first, then louder as days passed. Had visited friends I had drifted away from. I read books that made me smile. I slept with the window open, letting the night air feel like freedom instead of fear. My house became warm again, not because something new entered, but because something heavy left. One day, I met Daniel at a small coffee shop just to catch up. When he walked in, he looked lighter. Not younger, not different, just lighter, like the shadows in his eyes had finally let in some sun. We talked. Not like a couple, not like ex-lovers, but like two people who had been through a quiet storm and survived. At one point, he smiled and said, "You know, you saved me in ways I didn't deserve." I shook my head. "No, Daniel, you saved yourself. I just stepped out of the way so you could finally see the door." He didn't argue. He just looked at me with a softness I had never seen before. Near the end of our conversation, he asked a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you think we'll ever find our way back to each other?" I took a long breath. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I answered with honesty, not hope, not fear. "I don't know," I said gently, "but I do know we're both becoming better people, and maybe that's all that matters right now." He nodded. There was no sadness in his eyes, just understanding. And that was the moment I realized something incredible. Love doesn't always end when a relationship does. Sometimes it simply changes shape. I was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset melt into soft orange clouds. The breeze was gentle. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Life felt peaceful again. My phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "I'm truly happy you're doing well," he wrote. "Thank you for giving me space to become someone I'm not ashamed to be." I typed my reply slowly. "And thank you for finally letting me breathe. We both deserved that." When I hit send, I realized something powerful. I wasn't waiting for him anymore. I wasn't hoping. I wasn't hurting. I was finally free, not because I walked away from him, but because I walked back to myself. Healing is not loud. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic music. Healing comes in quiet mornings, warm cups of tea, long breaths, gentle steps. It comes in forgiveness, not the kind that excuses the past, but the kind that releases you from holding it. Sometimes the people we love do not know how to love us back in the ways we need, fighting battles we cannot see, battles we cannot fix for them. And sometimes, letting go is the kindest thing we can do, for them and for ourselves. If I could go back to that wedding night, to that moment when I heard Daniel crying in the dark, I wouldn't change a thing. Not because it wasn't painful, blinds, but because that moment shaped everything that followed. Baroth, blunt, brunette, the healing, and finally, the freedom. I live gently. I love softly. I breathe fully. And I carry no anger, no bitterness, just peace. And if you're listening to my story right now, I hope you find your peace too. I hope you choose yourself with courage. I hope you walk toward the life that lets you breathe, because we all deserve a love that doesn't dim our light, including the love we give ourselves.